Well, hello. My name is Greg Phipps. I'm the General Manager of RMLD, Reading Municipal Light Department. Reading Municipal Light Department serves 4 towns: Wilmington, North Reading, Reading, and Linfield Center. We are starting a podcast. We'd like to share all the different crazy things that we do at RMLD. Today we're going to talk about power supply. We're going to talk about how power supply helps us deliver reliable, low-cost, non-carbon power to our customers. That would be you, our customers. Back in 2021, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts introduced some legislation called the 2021 Climate Bill that set some targets to be non-carbon supplied power, 50% in 2030, 75% in 2040, and net zero by 2050. Today I'm joined by Bill Bullock. He is the Director of IRD, Integrated Resources at RMLD, and also by Julie. And Julie is our Communications Manager, also at RMLD. We're going to have Julie at the very end of our discussion answer a few customer questions, or actually she'll be asking the customer questions. I think I get to answer those. But for right now, we're going to turn it over to Bill. And Bill, I've got a couple questions. If you could first describe your role at RMLD, a little bit of your background, and then we'll jump into power supply.
Sure. It's good to be here with Greg and Julie on our first episode of the RMLD Current Insights. So I am the Director of Integrated Resources, and as the Director of Integrated Resources, I am making sure that the resources needed to meet our load is there. So that means power supply is obviously an important part of that. But also, as part of the integrated resources, we're also responsible for interactions with customers. That includes, customer billing, setting rates for customers, and also running the energy efficiency and decarbonization program. So, the energy transition really depends on a lot of factors, and certainly the biggest part of that is that we're able to decarbonize our power supply. Now, my background, I have been in the energy industry my entire career. I started actually building coal plants, moved on to natural gas plants, and eventually moved on to renewable resources, which is what I'm focused on now.
Great, good. And Bill, we're so glad to have you as part of the RMLD team. So power supply, current power supply. Give us a little bit of background on what the current power supply looks like, maybe a little bit of an overview. Talk a little bit about maybe some of the resources that we use.
Sure. So it's a complex power supply. We do have dozens of contracts that comprise it. We try to lock in long-term contracts from diverse resources. And as a result of that, we have a lot of contracts. And currently, we have a very diverse portfolio. And much of it is non-carbon supply. So we have nuclear assets, which are about a quarter of our supply. We have a lot of hydro supply, which is about 30% of our supply. And then we also have some growing wind and solar resources that kind of round out the non-carbon portion. And then, we're having what we don't contract for, we have to buy off the market. And currently, a lot of that is not non-carbon. It's sort of mixed resources. But our goal is to comply with the 2021 law and actually be ahead of that. We do have a plan in place to gradually increase the percent of our non-carbon portfolio so that it does not create price shocks for our customers.
Perfect. Yeah. No price shocks for the customers. Steady Eddie. You mentioned diversification, Bill. Talk a little bit about diversification in terms of how it contributes to the reliability component of our power supply as well as the low cost. And you talked a little bit already about non-carbon, but give us a little bit of sense of why, of how that power supply contributes to reliability. Talk to me about geography as well as the different mix and the characterization of different power supply sources.
Sure. So we do have power supplies from all over New England. So there are assets, whether they be hydro, wind, or solar assets that are located throughout New England that we do contract with. We're always shopping for the best prices for that, and we're trying to lock in those prices for as long term as we can, so that we have certainty of supply. And of course, the diversity is important because the weather is different everywhere. These assets have very different operating profiles. A hydro plant operates at a very different load profile than
Talk a
a
little
solar
about
plant.
use hydro and kind of contrast that to solar and maybe wind
Sure.
and nuclear. Just a little contrast in terms of how they might look different.
Sure. So hydro, you get the most output of hydro in the springtime when the snow starts to melt and it's rainier. Of course, this summer we had a lot of rain, so hydro produced more than usual this summer. Of course, that and if you look at a solar plant, it's going to produce more in the summer when the days are long and the sun is out and the skies are clear. And then wind is a different animal altogether because the wind can blow at any time. It's a little less predictable. You know when the sun is going to be out, but you don't know when it's going to be windy. But you know that the wind blows consistently over the year. It's just a matter of working that intermittency into the portfolio. And then, of course, I did mention we do have some nuclear assets in there, and nuclear is good because it provides a very good base load. It's going to be on, it's going to be there. And so we have contracted with a significant amount because it helps us meet our non-carbon goal.
So nuclear, unlike the other resources, unlike hydro and unlike solar and unlike wind, sounds like nuclear runs all the time.
Yeah, pretty much. They will have scheduled outages so they can do maintenance on the asset, but typically they run very consistently at a very steady, even load, and you can really depend on it. So it's important to have that as part of the mix so that we can really meet our requirements, our load requirements.
So, Bill, we'll talk about cost here in a little more in just a second, but kind of thinking about nuclear and hydro and solar and wind, just a little bit, maybe take just a moment or two, talk about how our load profile might look over a 24-hour period, and then how the load profile might look over the course of a year. And then we can talk a little more about how the power supply has to match that load.
Sure. So typically, we're about 30%, 30 to 40% residential load, and we're about 30% industrial and 30% commercial. So, each of those has a slightly different load profile, but what typically happens is, in different seasons you have different load profiles, but typically in the summer, the load is primarily driven by air conditioning and the change in the load. So the load is going to increase the most in the afternoon when it's the warmest, and then it hits a peak in the late afternoon, typically when people get home and also turn on their air conditioners at home. And then overnight, the load drops off as the night cools off because it is driven a lot by air conditioning. So, a lot of times we're managing that peak period that's driven by air conditioning in the summer. But in the winter, you also have a smaller peak. So when people, in the morning when people wake up, typically when furnaces turn on or heat pumps turn on, they're going to increase the load in the morning before they go to work. And then you have a slight decrease in the middle of the day. And you also, in the middle of the day, you'll have whatever solar generation there is. If someone has solar in their house, it's going to reduce the load. And that does have an incremental effect on the total load at RMLD as well as across the entire ISO New England network. And then, in the winter also, when people get home, they're turning on lights, they're cooking, they're turning on their heat, and the load goes up again. So you get another peak there. We do expect, with the adoption of more heat pumps for heating, which uses electricity as the fuel, that we will see more peaks in the winter coming up. We think there's about a 10-year period before the heat pumps will create a winter peak that will overcome the summer peak, but we expect it to eventually happen.
So it sounds like, Bill, load is changing all the time. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to think about how storage kind of fits into both storage, but also how generation adapts to fill in the load,
Yeah.
kind of load following, for lack of a better word. But just to kind of summarize what you just said a second ago, sounds like highest load summertime typically, driven a lot by air conditioning, driven by weather.
Yeah.
There's a winter little peak for the winter,
Mm-hmm.
and it sounds like spring and fall less so because less weather related. Temperatures are somewhat moderate.
Right.
I think the other thing you just said is that nighttime is generally speaking lower load currently than the daytime early evening are the peak loads.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of talk a little bit about, from the load perspective of load always changing, how the regional network is managed, and then how we might use storage and how the network might use storage to adapt to those peaks.
Sure. So the regional network needs to make sure, ISO New England was created to manage the market and make sure that there were enough resources generating power to deliver the load that's there and the demand. So ISO New England is always running the control system, monitoring the load and making sure there are enough resources to meet that load. And the same thing, each individual utility, like RMLD, is making sure that they have enough resources to meet the load that they have. We do that, and of course, we try to make sure that we have enough energy contracted to cover a lot of that load. But of course, you can't predict with perfect precision, so there's always going to be a little bit of buying on the spot market, and we try to make sure we've covered about 90% of our supply, and we're not exposed to more than 10% of the spot market price. So we do try to manage that so that if load is under what we expect, we're not over contracted for that load.
Yeah.
And then even if there are price spikes, they are mitigated by the fact that it's a small percentage of our overall load
portfolio.
Yeah.
And Bill, we're starting to not explore, we have a storage system already, a battery storage system. Talk a little bit about that and how we use that and how we're starting to look at battery storage for more than just peak management. So talk a little about peak management and storage systems and then where it might go.
Sure. So a big part of our cost structure is, I talked about how we import power from different assets around New England. So we have to transmit that power needs to be transmitted from the resources to our customers in Reading. So we need to be able, in order to move that power, we need to pay the transmission owners that own the transmission lines. So a significant part of our cost and a growing part of our cost is reimbursing those transmission owners for that cost, and that cost is determined by how much we import. So basically by our peak usage. So our battery allows us to dispatch the output of the battery to coincide with the peak on the overall system so that we import less when that cost is being calculated. This results in a big cost savings to our customers. And of course, as a not-for-profit, that savings is passed on to all customers and the benefits are shared by them. And anything we can do, so we also, the battery is not the only way we try to shed the peak. We also we encourage customers to reduce usage during peak periods so that so that we can reduce our overall costs. Of course, anyone that if you can run your dishwasher later at night after the peak, if you can cook a little later or cook outside on your grill instead of on your stove, that will help to shift the peak.
So that's part of our peak management program. That's good, Bill.
Yeah.
You mentioned that transmission is a big piece of our cost structure. We're going to talk a little about how we look to adopt more renewable. But just real quick summary, what are the key components that make up our power supply cost structure? It's roughly, two-thirds to three-quarters, depending upon what year it is and how much customers use from a usage perspective.
Yeah.
But how big is power supply from a cost perspective?
Yeah.
And what are the key components?
Yeah. So as you said, it's about 2/3 of our overall cost structure this year. And the cost structure consists of a couple of different parts. There's the energy, where we need to buy the actual electricity from the people who make it, and so that is about half the cost. And then we also have the transmission costs that I talked about
Hmm.
as we reimburse the transmission owners. That is probably about 40%, and it is growing. And then if we look at the capacity, and capacity, I did not talk about that before, but it's similar to transmission, but it's the way that we reimburse the owners of the generation to participate in the market. So
Be ready.
and be ready for when we need it. So when demand is increasing, those generation owners will be signaled by the ISO to be ready to start up because they're going to be needed to run. And as compensation for being ready to run, they are paid this capacity fee.
Capacity fee. Good, good. Thank you, Bill. You mentioned that you had talked a little bit about energy that we buy. The majority of our generation is outside of our territory.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that we pay capacity and transmission costs to have that brought to our territory. And then within our territory, we have a distribution network that feeds the buildings, the houses, the industrial facilities as well. As we think about more and more renewable resources, talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing from a within territory generation perspective, kind of a couple of examples and how we're thinking about it and why that's a direction we should go. From primarily a cost perspective, we'll leave the reliability for another discussion in terms of within territory, but talk a little about cost, why that might be advantageous.
Sure. So, I talked about the fact that we do import a significant amount of our power from outside the territory, but having generation in territory, so that means that we don't have to import and move on the transmission owner's lines, and putting it closer to where our load is, means that it automatically creates cost savings to our customers because we don't have to pay to move that on the transmission line. So the more the one drawback is that the towns that we serve are pretty densely populated, and there is not a lot of open land. So it is a challenge to fit those in, but we are looking for opportunities wherever we can to find that space. And one of the things we're looking at is solar on rooftops of commercial sites. We already have a very robust solar program that a lot of customers participate in, but getting more larger projects on large roofs is really a good way for us to integrate. We're also looking at more storage in the territory, which allows us to not only shave the peaks, but it also allows us to work with the intermittency of the renewables because, as I said, with solar and wind, you can't always depend on them operating. So if you can integrate some batteries into the system, that allows us to store some of that excess energy when it's abundant and then discharge it when resources are a little lower.
Yeah. So you started bringing us into some of the innovative technologies that we're looking at. You mentioned within territory generation. You mentioned solar arrays, storage systems. We're doing this work, kind of a school bus pilot program. Talk a little about that and how that might apply to more broadly to EVs. So what are we doing in that school bus program?
Sure. So the thing about electric vehicles is they do have large batteries. So they're typically currently lithium-ion batteries. So that is the current technology that even our standalone large utility scale batteries are also lithium-ion. So, but any vehicle has a battery in it, and there is a synergy with school buses. School buses are used, during limited hours, typically early in the morning and in the early afternoon, and they're not used in the summer. So in the summer, when our peaks are happening, these batteries are available. They're on wheels, but they're still lithium-ion batteries, the same technology that we use to shave our peaks. So we are looking at a pilot to do a vehicle-to-grid charger on the RMLD site so that we can have a bus parked there during peak periods and when it's not being used by the school, and it can discharge and help us manage our peak load. So very innovative program.
An innovative program. That's excellent. Pretty fascinating. And talk a little about how that might set the stage down the road for our individual customers that have EVs to participate in the program at their choice, of course. But How might that work, and what might that mean for them?
Yeah. So, an EV also has a battery. It's smaller than a school bus's, but it's still there. The good thing about it is there are a lot of them, and hopefully there will be more. I think we have about 1,000 in our service territory currently, and we expect that to grow significantly over the next few years. And each one of those batteries has the ability to, discharge energy when it's needed. It's just a matter of unlocking the potential of that with the correct charger technology.
Right.
And if we can do that, we can help share the benefit with the car owner so that they can get reimbursed for
A bill credit.
letting us use that energy. And not only does it benefit them through a payment, but it will also help lower costs for all customers.
All systems. Excellent. And kind of talking about our customers, kind of the last question, what other things can they be doing? Talk a little about maybe peak management or air source heat pumps or EVs. What things can our customers can do to help us manage our cost structure and our goal and the compliance obligation to be non-carbon by 2050? What can customers do?
Yeah.
Some
So
things.
one of the important things I talked about, shred the peak. So if they can do that, that will be sure that we're not buying resources when they're the most expensive, so that we're able to plan better. So the lower that our peak is, and the flatter our load profile is, the lower our cost structure will be, because we have utilization of a lot of resources over a lot of hours that tends to drive down costs. But also, customers, and a lot of our customers are doing this, they're also shifting their usage from fossil fuels to electricity. And as we clean up the portfolio, the idea is that will drive the carbon emissions associated with those uses down. We do provide incentives for heat pumps. We do provide incentives for electric vehicles, and we're always willing, because we know people have questions. So we're always willing to answer questions. So you can call into the customer service line, and if you have a question about whether an EV or a heat pump is right for you, we're happy to help.
And we actually have a team in place. Good.
Yeah,
Bill, thanks. Thanks for spending time with us today, Bill. I know you and your team spend a lot of time on a daily basis managing the power supply portfolio from a tactical perspective and a strategic perspective. So thank you. Julie, we're going to jump over to you. At the end of each episode, we're going to do one or two customer questions. I'll let you kind of give a little bit of background. I think you have two questions here, and I'll do my best to answer them before I close.
Sure. Well, for starters, that was a great discussion to both of you. And as Greg mentioned, we will close each episode with a customer question. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We have a dedicated email address that is podcast@rmld.com. So if you send us a question and we choose to answer it on the air, you'll get a nice shout out. So today's question is from Casey in Reading. So Casey's question was, I'd be interested on if you were able to provide examples of switching to a mini split or heat pump, how much money you'd save over time. I'd like to know the break-even timeline from the investment and savings compared to heating my home and cooling my home with oil or gas.
From Casey. Casey, thanks for that great question. Each building will be a little bit different. So the details of the size of the system and the configuration of the system, you'll need to work with one of the contractors that have been through the training program in terms of how to properly size heat pumps. But just for rough numbers, typical single room upfront cost, initial investment would be somewhere between $6,000 and $12,000 just for a general range. If you're doing a whole house, where a whole house might be a 2,000 square foot colonial, it might be somewhere between $18,000 to up toward to $36,000. So, maybe an average of $24,000 for a typical house, and maybe an average of $6,000 or $7,000 for a single room. But those numbers are going to depend heavily on the actual configuration of your house, and the contractors are actually expert in terms of doing the proper sizing. The payback period is the interesting piece. And depending upon how hot you keep or how warm you keep your property or how cool you keep it, remember air source heat pumps do both heating and cooling. And so they are intended to substitute for a traditional window air conditioner or a traditional central air conditioner. But equally importantly, they're intended to replace either an oil or natural gas furnace in the wintertime. One thing about them is that it's kind of set it and forget it. You can set it at 68 or set it at 72 or whatever number, and the system actually is very good in terms of managing the temperature in your house. Heat pumps are basically moving heat either into the building in the wintertime from outside into the building, or in the summertime taking heat out of the building and moving heat from inside the building and moving it outside of the building. So the only energy it uses is just to move heat rather than generate heat, which is what oil and natural gas do, or resistive electric heat might do as well. They tend to be anywhere from rough average at 300% efficient, where a traditional, and I say 300%, you get 3 times the heat heat moved versus the power you put in. A very efficient furnace might be in the mid-90s, so much more efficient. So the costs are going to be, your actual operating costs are going to be less than when you're using oil and natural gas to heat. And these newer systems are also more efficient than window or central air conditioners, so they'll be more efficient as well. Payback periods are going to depend upon the initial investment. It could be from a couple of years, maybe up to 8 to 10 years, depending upon the investment and the size of the system. The best time to be thinking about an air source heat pump would be when you are thinking about replacing your oil or natural gas furnace system or your air conditioning system. And as Julie mentioned, we have experts here to help point you in the right direction, get you started. And so hopefully that answers your question, Casey. Thank you. All right, so we'll do one question at the end. Casey, once again, thank you. We're going to close out this episode. We want to say thank you, Bill, thank you, Julie, and thank you, Casey, for the question. And we look to see you at our next episode of Current Insights from RMLD. And my name is Greg Phipps. I'm the host.